So who likes this deal? Who are the people that stood behind this deal? Because it was very controversial when it was released, and there were many, many people who spoke out against the deal. And we're going to talk about them in a minute. But right now, if you take a look at the people who think that this was a good deal, first of all, I've included a quote here by Hans Blick, who was the former Director General of the IAEA, very, very solidly stands behind it. And in the list of individuals I've provided, William Perry, who's the Secretary of Defense, Madeleine Albright. Significantly, you have the former director of Mossad, which is the Israeli intelligence service, and then the former director of Shin Bet, which is the Israeli domestic intelligence service, as well as the former chief of the Israeli Navy. There are scientists from the Israeli Dimona facility who stand behind this, as along with most of the U.S. foreign policy community and intelligence community that has anything to do with the Middle East or Iran. So all of these individuals believe that this was a good deal and that it would stop Iran from achieving a nuclear weapons program. So what we're going to do now is we're going to move on to who didn't like the deal. And the reason that I'm doing this section of this lecture is because there's a lot of misinformation that was put out during the origins of the deal and during the 2016 election that were basically used to advance a political agenda, as opposed to putting out the information that is accurate to what the deal actually achieves. So I will now start talking about some statements from individuals and then go to what they were actually talking about within the deal. So the first person we're going to discuss is Senator Bob Corker. Senator Bob Corker is the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So when the team, the State Department team, John Kerry and Ernie Moniz and Wendy Sherman, returned from their negotiations, they sat down before Congress and allowed Congress to question them so that the senators can go back and determine whether they were going to support this deal based on their questioning of the negotiators and the explanation of the provisions within the deal. So during these hearings, these are the statements and the questions that were put out. And now the chairman says that for a deal that must be built on verification and not trust, the inspection process is deeply flawed. So right away, we know that this statement is not founded in any reality, because the inspection process is the most intrusive inspection process that has ever been created, and it has only been agreed to by the Iranians. So through verbal presentations regarding possible military dimensions, many in Congress are aware of the unorthodox arrangements agreed to by the IAEA and the administration. He goes on to say those actual agreements remain secret, but we know at best they are most unusual. So what is he talking about? What are these agreements? So when the deal was first being discussed in the U.S. narrative, there were many who were saying that there were some secret agreements between the Iranians and the IAEA, and that Congress, before they could support this deal, needed to see what those agreements were. And the IAEA said, we're not going to show you the agreements. And there is a reason for that, because what these secret agreements are, they are classified agreements between the IAEA and every one of its member states. So when a state negotiates its safeguards agreement with the IAEA, they have subsidiary agreements that are specific to their nuclear facilities and capabilities. These are classified. The IAEA does not share this information with other member states because it needs this confidentiality in order to fulfill its mandate. If the IAEA started sharing capabilities of one member state to the other, it would no longer be a legitimate entity and would not be able to fulfill its mandate. So every single member state that has an agreement with the IAEA has classified agreements that are used to set up specific inspection regimes specific to what facilities each state has. So when this congressman is saying that these are unorthodox arrangements and they're unusual, this is not true. They're actually very usual, and every member state has one. has these types of agreements. The IAEA won't share them with anyone, and ultimately they did not share them with Congress. John Boehner, who was the Speaker of the House at the time that the deal was agreed to, who is no longer in politics, had this to say. He said that the agreement actually lifts arms and embargo agreements in 8 to 5 years. This is true. He's correct here. But it allows Iran to build ICBMs capable of delivering nuclear warheads right here to the United States. Now understand, the majority of the US population, the majority of the world, they do not understand nuclear fuel cycles and ICBMs and all of it. But what they do understand is that an American political leader is telling them that this deal allows Iran to deliver a warhead to the United States. So is that true? Let's see what the Iranians have. This is a cross-section of the Iranians' missile capabilities. They have the Ghadar-1. Now this can go 1,800 kilometers. Understand that any missile going from Iran to the United States would have to deliver a very, very heavy payload, approximately 11,000 kilometers. So this missile cannot get to the United States. It's under development, it has not been deployed. The Sejal-2, this is a two-stage solid-fueled missile, so very dangerous. Solid fuel means that you can this is road mobile. This can be carried around on a truck and fired from anywhere. This can go 3,000 kilometers. Also, it is under development. It has not been deployed. So what do they have that they is deployed and is operational? Well, they have the Shahab-3. This is based on a Scud. It can carry 1,100 kilograms, which is enough for a nuclear weapon. But again, it can only go 1,000 kilometers. So what do they have that could be a dual-use technology that might actually be able to deliver a weapon to the United States? The only thing that they have that fits that profile is their space launch vehicle, the Safir-1. But the problem with using a space launch vehicle as an ICBM, first of all, it's only designed to carry a satellite. Those weigh about 100 kilograms. A nuclear weapon can weigh 500 to 1,000. So this is not what these things are designed to carry. Also, it's only supposed to go straight up. It's supposed to deliver a satellite into space. It's not necessarily designed to go 11,000 kilometers, more like 500. So in order for the Iranians to use this technology to create an ICBM, they would have to redesign their airframe to be much more solid so it can carry the heavier payload under those circumstances. They would have to have a fuel that's much more energetic, and they would have to develop a re-entry vehicle, and they would have to have a nuclear weapon. So we know they do not have a nuclear weapon. If they did have a nuclear weapon, they would need to test it, which they've not tested. And if they did test it, we would know it. And they would have to engage in research and development on a re-entry vehicle. When you fire a missile into space and you launch your weapon towards your adversary, that has to survive the heat and the kinetic energy of re-entry through the atmosphere. So it's very hot and it's very unstable. So the re-entry vehicle has to have little jets on it that spin it like a bullet, otherwise it would break itself into pieces. So there is no evidence the Iranians have advanced anywhere when it comes to both having a weapon, having a re-entry vehicle, and then also taking their space launch vehicle and redesigning it so that it can make up for the deficiencies inherent in being an SLV as opposed to an ICBM. So when John Boehner says that this deal allows for the Iranians to reach the US with an ICBM, it's just straight up not true. It may be true someday, but according to this deal and according to current capabilities, it's just not true. Now, I've included Ben Carson here because he is no longer a candidate for political office. He is a political appointee now, but during his run for the presidency, he brought up something that was also dragged through the US media and used as a political weapon against the Obama administration and the negotiators of the deal. And he said any agreement that Iran allows to enrich uranium without an anytime, anywhere inspection is extremely dangerous. And what he's talking about is there are those who wanted to make sure that in the deal that anytime the IAEA wanted to inspect anything, they could just go there and inspect it. Well, there's two things here. A, that's never going to happen. There's no such thing as anytime, anywhere under that guideline. To inspect anything from the IAEA or any inspecting entity to a state that has a facility that they want to see, there's a negotiation process on who's going to go, where they're going to go, who's going to receive them, how they're going to get to the facility, who's going to receive them at the facility, how they're going to see the things that they want to see within the facility, but keep hidden the things that have not been agreed to be seen. It takes time. There's no such thing as anytime, anywhere. And so it was said that President Obama at the time had said that there would be an anytime, anywhere, but there was anytime. The quote was from our Secretary of Energy, Ernie Moniz, who said that there was an anytime, anywhere inspection provision within the JCPOA. And then the conclusion of his sentence was within an agreed time frame. So they took this statement that there will be anytime, anywhere inspections within an agreed time frame, lost the agreed time frame part, and created this political tool to speak out against the JCPOA, when in actuality this provision was addressed. So we're going to move on. Senator Ted Cruz says the Iranians get 24 days notice before any inspections. That's a play on what that actually is. Even then, no American inspectors will be allowed, and most outrageously, certain circumstances, Iran will be allowed to inspect itself and report back on the results. So what is he talking about? Because this was all over the news, and a lot of people were picking this up and running with it, saying, why would the Iranians be allowed to self-inspect? What Ted Cruz was talking about was not Natanz or Fordow or Iraq and self-inspection of those facilities. What Ted Cruz was talking about was the resolution of the possible military dimension to the Iranian program and their agreement with the IAEA to solve that issue. Parchin was a military facility that had a high explosive test chamber. This facility was suspected by the IAEA of having nuclear weapon design activities. This is a classified military installation. The Iranians did not want the IAEA to inspect it and claimed that they'd had no business inspecting it because there was no fissile material. It's a military installation. The IAEA said, we need to go in and make sure because we suspect there might be fissile material. Here was the crux of the disagreement. So, in order to resolve this issue, the IAEA and the Iranians conducted an inspection at Parchin that provided for Iranian inspectors to go to this site and take environmental samples and return these environmental samples to the IAEA inspection team that were at the entrance to the facility. How that was done to the IAEA satisfaction is classified. But the statement of the Director General of the IAEA after these samples were returned to the IAEA was, using the technology and the techniques that we used, we are 100% certain that the samples obtained from the Iranians came from the site and at the time frame that we needed them to come from, and this allows the IAEA to close this file. So when Ted Cruz was stating to the media that the Iranians were self-inspecting, this is what he was talking about. This was the resolution of the past military dimensions, possible military, had nothing to do with Natanz or Fordow or Iraq. Those are inspected by IAEA inspectors. Benjamin Netanyahu, he spoke out against the deal and is currently still against the deal. And what he said was Iran will get a jackpot, a cash bonanza of hundreds of billions of dollars, which will enable it to continue to pursue its aggression and terror in the region and the world. Well, we've already discussed the monetary component of this. Iran didn't get a jackpot or a cash bonanza. What they got was access to their own funds that had been restricted for 10 years. And the second part of that statement is sure, we don't know how the Iranians are going to use that money. Most likely it's going to be to pay off the debt they've incurred while they were under sanctions. And they'll more than likely use it to advance their hegemonic ambitions in the region. But when you say that they're going to use this money to pursue their terror in the region and the world, you know, you don't need $100 billion to support a terrorism program. What you need is terrorists. And you don't need a lot of money. You need trucks or knives or guns or a small amount of explosive. So this was a scare technique used by Benjamin Netanyahu that was basically based on a falsehood. There are concerns in this regard, but not in how it was phrased here. So Marco Rubio, who's a senator of Florida, ran for president of the United States. And even though this is history, he did say something that it's worth mentioning. And he said that if he was the president, then he would increase sanctions and he would back him up with a credible military force. Now, there are hawks in the U.S. government today that are advocating policies that could lead to a war with Iran. So what would that mean? How would you take out the Iranian facilities? Now, Israel attacked a facility in Syria and Iraq in the past and took out a facility. They were able to do this with just a few fighter jets and some explosives. What would it take to do the same in Iran? Well, Iran has spread out their facilities throughout their country. And Fordow and Natanz are both fortified and buried under mountains. So for anybody to conduct any kind of a military intervention to take out the Iranian nuclear program would take a massive effort that would require staging naval assets in the region. We would need overflight permission from our allies in the region. We would need to use all of our military bases in the region. And basically, we would be opening up certainly a regional conflict that could grow even further. Additionally, the Iranians have taken possession of anti-aircraft missiles they purchased from the Russians. These are S-300s. These are very sophisticated. They can track multiple aircraft from as high as 30 kilometers, from 160 kilometers out. They're very, very dangerous. So to say that we would increase sanctions and then back it up with military force is a very irresponsible statement, considering what that actually means. It would most certainly start a regional conflict and would cost many, many lives on every side of the conflict. Now we're going to talk about then candidate Donald Trump, simply because what he said, there's relevance to what's in the deal. So one of his first statements was, there's something in the Iranian deal that people don't know or don't understand, and that is, if somebody attacks Iran, we have to come to their defense. And I'm saying, does that include Israel? And people say yes. So he believes that if somebody attacks Iran, including Israel, the United States has to defend Iran. So what could he possibly be referring to? Because this was something that was spread throughout the US media. And what he's talking about is nuclear security. So through cooperation and training workshops, states agree to strengthen Iran's ability to protect against and respond to nuclear security threats, including sabotage. This is why we discussed Stuxnet earlier in this lecture. The IAEA is the world's knowledge bank when it comes to nuclear security. And protecting against sabotage or cyber attacks is part of that knowledge sharing, that the IAEA is the central hub for all of its member state. So states share information with the IAEA, and then the IAEA disseminates it to strengthen state security at their nuclear facilities. Because Stuxnet attacked an enrichment facility and broke a bunch of centrifuges, which is an inconvenience and cost the Iranians money and time. What if that same virus was at Bushehr and melted down the reactor? Then you would get a radioactive plume that was spread to not only over Iran, but throughout the region and elsewhere. So this is why states cooperate against enemies and adversaries alike to provide information to enhance nuclear security. And that is what Donald Trump was talking about during his campaign when he said the U.S. has to protect Iran against states, and including Israel. He was discussing nuclear security, which is actually to the benefit to everyone involved. He also had something to say about the negotiating team, and it's important that we discuss this because you need to see who the U.S. sent to do the negotiating. So what what Donald Trump said was, we have the greatest business people in the world, but we use political hacks. We use ambassadors. He called John Kerry and the negotiating team incompetent. So who is he talking about? This is the core of our team. John Kerry led it, but the negotiations were handled by our Secretary of Energy, Ernie Moniz. Ernie Moniz has a PhD in theoretical physics, and he's head of the Department of Physics at MIT. He's the director of the Bates Linear Accelerator. He's a brilliant physicist, and during the negotiations, he had experts from all U.S. nuclear laboratories at his disposal. Sitting with him was Wendy Sherman, a brilliant diplomat and an international law specialist. She was also the CEO and president of Fannie Mae Foundation, which makes her a very high-level business person. So when it was stated we should use business people, actually Wendy Sherman has about as big of a background in business as you can get, as Fannie Mae is the largest holder of mortgages in the world, basically. So she's an Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. She has all this wonderful experience on top of being a business person. So this is who was being described as incompetent. So if they're incompetent, who are sitting across the table? Who would you put across the table for these individuals? Well, first you have Ali Akbar Salahi. He's the head of the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran. He also has a PhD in nuclear engineering. The significance about Salahi, though, in his resume here is that he was the chancellor of Sharif University. And what you should know about that is that Sharif University had a clandestine procurement channel set up. Sharif University maintained the Tehran research reactor, which is a legitimate nuclear research reactor. So Sharif University was able to buy materials and technologies it needed to maintain and operate this facility. At Sharif University, while Salahi was the chancellor, they set up a clandestine procurement network. And that is how the Iranians got Natanz and Fordo and Iraq without the whole world knowing. Sitting with Salahi was Mohammad Javad Zarif, who has a PhD of international law and policy from the University of Denver, 2 master's degrees. He was the Iranian ambassador to the United Nations. The man is a brilliant diplomat and he's a brilliant attorney. So you don't want to be careless about who you set across the table from these gentlemen when you're talking about negotiating a nuclear agreement. So has the Iranians been in compliance? Yes. They went over on the amount of heavy water they were allowed to accumulate. On both occasions, they shipped the excess out of the country right away. And since then, there have been 13 Director General reports maintaining that the Iranians are in full compliance with their obligations within the deal. So in today's environment, the Iranian deal has taken a lot of fire from the U.S. Donald Trump has declared that he is going to withdraw from the deal and reimpose U.S. sanctions, which has actually happened. But it should be noted that this is an agreement. This is not a treaty. There is no withdrawal provision. The only thing that the United States could do was violate the deal by reimposing sanctions, which is exactly what happened. But what should we really be looking at? Okay, so the Iranians could cheat, but right now with the deal, we have visuals into all of their programs. So if they cheated, we'd know immediately. Once the deal restrictions expire, they could decide to pursue a weapons program. To do that, they would have to kick all of the inspectors out, so we'd know that right away. They could divert unrestricted funds to finance terrorists. They probably are doing that. But again, as I mentioned, they don't need $100 billion to do that. They just need, they were state sponsors of terrorism for many years prior to gaining those funds, and they were advancing those policies nicely without the money that they were gaining access to. Restored Iranian economy allows it to broaden its hegemonic ambition. Well, this is true. So Iran's foreign policy is moving along nicely. They've got a frozen conflict in Yemen that's tying up the Saudi Arabian military and is basically a global political nightmare on top of the humanitarian disaster that's been created. The Iranians have Iraq. They have major influence in what was traditionally their worst enemy. They are projecting force on the ground in Syria. They control Hezbollah in Lebanon. So they're what they really need to do is they need an economy, because they're moving along in their regional ambitions nicely without a nuclear weapon. With this economy, they can modernize and expand their conventional forces, which is something they desperately need. They can continue to increase ballistic missile technology. Here is something that we should look at. We should look at as a separate agreement. You don't want to throw away the nuclear deal because it doesn't include ballistic missile language. What you want to do is hold on to the nuclear deal because it stops them from getting a weapon, and then start new negotiations to put restrictions on their ballistic missile program. The Iranians now are going to be able to develop closer ties with Russia as a primary weapon supplier. The Iranian conventional military forces are antiquated and are very poorly maintained, and they need to spend money that the Russians will be more than happy to take from them and sell them as a primary weapon supplier. There are proliferation concerns because the Iranians are enriching, and then you have to watch what the Israelis are going to do, because Netanyahu has threatened to attack the Iranians on a number of occasions. So these are the areas that really we should be focusing on, as opposed to all of these political footballs and all this misinformation that's used when the deal is actually working the way it was intended. So now that the United States is violating the agreement, what kind of support do you think that it's going to garner from other partners of the deal? Well, the Russians are more than happy to sell the Iranians the military equipment that they want to sell to them. The Russians also would like to form an energy coalition with the Iranians to hedge against OPEC. Between Russia and Iran, they've got the world's second largest supply of oil and natural gas. Also, there is something called the International North-South Transport Corridor that is almost completed, that will go through Iran and allow for direct trade between South Asia and Russia, and eliminate the need to ship around Europe through the Suez Canal, which is has political problems and financial issues. So the Russians are probably not going to honor US sanctions. Are the Chinese? Well, the Chinese, in January of 2016, agreed to 17 different memorandums of understanding, agreements that would ultimately amount to $660 billion worth of trade with the Iranians over 10 years. Now, the Chinese have not had a history of an adversarial history with the Iranians. There is no reason for the Chinese to comply with US sanctions, knowing that the US is applying these sanctions for political reasons, when the Chinese stand to benefit greatly from trade with Iran. And the Chinese are the #1 importer of Iranian oil. The EU has many, many agreements with the Iranians, and this violation of the deal by the US has driven a very serious wedge between the EU as a partner, in that the EU is now looking for some sort of a financial mechanism that they can use to conduct legal financial trade with the Iranians, even though the Iranians can no longer use the international banking system. The EU has also revitalized something called a blocking statute. And what this statute is something that makes it easier for the EU business community to trade with Iran outside of US sanctions. So the EU is doing what it can do to conduct trade and live up to its agreements with the Iranian in spite of US sanctions. Now, Turkey, which is a US ally, but has over the past several years moved in directions that don't necessarily converge with US interests, stands to benefit greatly by the Iranian trade and greatly by the North-South Transport Corridor. And then ultimately, the Iranians benefit greatly from this deal. They would be able to restore their economy, rebuild their military, become part of the global stage, part of the global economy. So where we are right now is the U.S. is in violation of the deal and has reimposed sanctions, but because it's viewed as a political move, the U.S. does not have the support of the partners of the deal. The partners of the deal are doing everything they can do to keep the deal afloat. So who are the people in the U.S. administration that are perpetuating U.S. policy when it comes to Iran now that we've decided to reimpose sanctions? That would be John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, and Brian Hook, both hawks, both of a long history of perpetuating policies that place the U.S. in a position that could result in a conflict in the region. John Bolton is somebody that I specifically want to point out. He's currently our National Security Advisor, and right after he took his office, Donald Trump made the statement that he was going to withdraw from the deal, and then subsequently did withdraw. What you should know about John Bolton is that this is not the first arms or disarmament deal that Bolton has influenced in a negative fashion. Back in the 90s, President Bill Clinton negotiated something called the Agreed Framework with the North Koreans. And what that Agreed Framework did was it allowed for inspections in North Korean facilities in return for economic relief and the construction of a couple of nuclear power reactors in North Korea by the South Koreans and the US. So this deal, the Agreed Framework, was in place for 10 years, and the North Koreans, towards the end of those 10 years, violated or basically cheated on their end. And when this happens, you have to understand that in any treaty, states push their limits. They try to see what they can get away with. Now, the Agreed Framework had language in it that prevented the North Koreans from producing a nuclear weapon utilizing plutonium from spent fuel. Did not address highly enriched uranium. 10 years into that agreement, a ship was discovered carrying materials that would lead to a highly enriched uranium program in North Korea. So they didn't specifically violate their agreement, but they went for a nuclear weapon down a different path. This was the case when the Bush administration took over, and John Bolton said that the first thing he wanted to do was smash the Agreed Framework. Ultimately, what he did is he got the U.S. to withdraw from that agreement. And now, fast forward to today, the North Koreans have nuclear weapons that can reach the United States. So what they could have done back in the early 2000s is they could have renegotiated the deal with the North Koreans, or at least tried and gotten a deal that included language on highly enriched uranium. Instead, they simply withdrew from the deal. And now you know what the results are. So fast forward to the Iranian deal. John Bolton hates the Iranian deal and convinced the president to withdraw from it. So the president has withdrawn from it. Now we are open to the Iranians backing out of their end of the deal, kicking inspectors out, and blinding us to all of their activities that we currently have visuals into. So it's dangerous. There are other ways of going about this. That is the conclusion of my talk. I'll be happy to take any questions if anybody has any questions for me.
Okay, thank you, Joe. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, great, thank you. The very comprehensive lectures, and I understand the situation is very complicated. So for those who will be viewing this lecture later, I just wanted to have some clarification. So I would like to ask just maybe a couple of questions. So I do understand that the only United States violates this agreement, right?
That's true.
Yes. So some people may misunderstand that because of the news that this Iran nuclear deal is completely gone, but that's not the case.
No.
So thank you. So in that case, so Iran, sorry, I'm not closely following, but so in Iran, so there is no more like a verification or a monitoring system. What's the current situation there after the U.S. violation?
Well, because the EU, Russia, and China have agreed to uphold their end of the agreement, the Iranians have not backed off any of their obligations when it comes to inspections and verifications. So the IAEA is still inspecting and verifying all of those provisions that I discussed throughout this lecture.
Great, thank you so much. I think that's a very, very important point. The International Atomic Energy Agency confirmed that Iran is in compliance. So moving forward, what do you think? What's Iran's next move? Can they continue to be in compliance, or, of course, it's very difficult to answer, but what's your opinion regarding Iran's next move?
Well, there's a couple of things that are going to determine that. First, there's an internal struggle that these sanctions by the U.S. are going to be they're going to be observed by many companies in many states, and they are going to withdraw their trade agreements and not conduct trade, and this is going to adversely affect the Iranian economy. And so you will have disagreeing factions within the Iranian government. You have the moderates under President Rouhani, who would like to see the deal survive, but then you have the Iranian Republican Guard, who at some point would like to see themselves with nuclear weapons and think that since the U.S. is violating the agreement should go away. So you have this internal struggle with Iran. Then you have, will the EU be successful with its blocking statute and with its alternative funding mechanism to be able to conduct enough trade with Iran that Iran believes that it's within its interests to continue with the deal? So there's a couple of, and there's more to it than that. But right now, like I said, the Iranians are in compliance. There's a recent report from the Director General that says they're in compliance with all of their provisions of the deal. There are deals that are going through that are continuing to work. And because the United States wanted to have sanctions that were as strict as they could possibly be. But the bottom line is that China and India import an enormous amount of oil from Iran. So they were able to gain waivers from the United States to decrease the amount of oil they import, but not comply with a 100% embargo like the U.S. would like them to do. So Iran is still selling oil to the Chinese and the Indians. So as long as that stays in place and the internal struggle doesn't go the way of the military and the EU is all able to conduct enough trade to satisfy the Iranians, the deal has a good chance of surviving.
Great, thank you. It's great to know that there's a chance that the deal have a chance to survive. So, according to a lecture and based on the very fact-based report, this Iran deal that was negotiated between the Obama administration and Iran seemed to be very reasonable, especially among the nuclear experts. And, then the Trump administration really did not like this deal. So why? I know there should be lots of reasons, but what's the main reason why the current U.S. administration wanted to withdraw from this deal?
Well, it's a combination of a couple of things, but the stated reason by the administration for believing that the deal was worth violating was that it wasn't comprehensive enough, and that it did not include ballistic missile language, and that the sunset provisions expired too soon. So when it comes to the sunset provisions, that's debatable whether they expired too soon, because the Comprehensive Safeguard Agreement, the additional protocol, the enrichment cooperation between the IAEA and the Iranians, a number of the provisions of the deal never expire. So that's a debatable point. The other point, that it did not include ballistic missile technology, is it's true, it did not. But the only time you'll see what they call a grand bargain, where a state is able to extract concessions across topics from its partner state or its negotiating partner. The only time that's ever happened in the history of politics has been after a massive conflict like a world war. The way this should have been done or could be done is you maintain the deal as it is to prevent the Iranians from getting a nuclear weapon and to keep our inspections in place, and then negotiate a separate agreement for ballistic missiles, which there are plenty of experts who have already outlined how that could be done, and it's all very reasonable. The administration says that all should be wrapped up in one deal. So basically what they're asking for is something that's never been done, and the Iranians have already stated that they're absolutely not going to even return to the negotiation table for that. So take that for what it is. It seems to me that it might have been a better move to hold on the deal the way it is, and then start a separate negotiation for the other issues that the West has with the Iranians when it comes to ballistic missiles and human rights and state sponsor of terrorism.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very understandable. So while there is a possibility that this deal is going to survive, in a worst case scenario, if Iran also reach the decision, or as you mentioned, due to some internal conflict and internal struggle, if this deal that Iran is going to also decide to withdraw, what's the most dangerous detrimental impact in the non-proliferation and the disarmament regime?
Well, I mean, you could really go down a dark road with that. The Iranians could legitimately kick all of the inspectors out of their country and begin a nuclear weapons program that we would have absolutely no understanding of. We do know that they have more advanced centrifuges under research and development, that they're ready to install and bring their enrichment up to an industrial level where they could feasibly create a nuclear weapons program and produce weapons at a very rapid rate, very, very quickly. And without the inspections, we wouldn't know anything about it. Additionally, the withdrawal provision of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, Article 10, says that if a state feels its security is threatened, it can legally withdraw from the Non-Proliferation Treaty. By the U.S. applying sanctions that could cripple the Iranian economy, the Iranian could feasibly say, this is an attack on our sovereignty, and we are going to withdraw from the treaty, and that could collapse the entire non-proliferation regime when it comes to non-proliferation treaty. So worst case scenario, they could kick everybody out, restart the nuclear weapons program, get a weapon, and not be held to any legally binding mechanism on it when it comes to international law, because they'd withdraw from the non-proliferation treaty. That's the worst case scenario. Since the hawks in this administration have not come right out and said that they would like to see a regime change. But that is what the Iranians' concern is that those who are advocating policies that could lead to a conflict with Iran from the Iranian perspective, that leads to a regime change. And the best way to protect against a regime change is to have a nuclear weapon. That's your ace in the hole. If you got a nuclear weapon, your government's secure. So the worst case scenario is that the Iranians become a nuclear weapon state. We won't know anything about how many they have or where they're deployed, and there will be nothing that we can do about that. Very much like there's nothing that we can really do about the North Koreans except for hope to contain them.
Okay, thank you. So yeah, if Iran decides to develop nuclear weapons, what's the ramification to the other countries in the Middle East, such as, like, of course, Iran, what's Israel going to do, or what's going to happen to Saudi Arabia? So anyway, but I do not want to end with a worst case scenario comment. So under the current difficult situation, what's the best scenario, or realistically best scenario in your view? I would like to at least some hope or some positive aspects to these students who are studying these nuclear issues. So could you share your positive aspect?
Yeah. I mean, my job is to look at the worst case scenario, because that's how we try to come up with solutions preventing that happening. The way the situation stands today is the only individuals who are speaking out against the deal and act against the deal is the president and a very small list of his closest advisors. Most of the national security community, the intelligence community, the US military, and the international community support this deal. So right now, what I believe is that there's a strategic patience, if I could borrow a North Korean term, on the US administration to see what happens in 2020. Because should Trump not be reelected, or if we should get a Democratic administration, there's 99% chance that this deal is going to be resupported by the US and recognized for the landmark positive international agreement that it is. And then these other negotiations can begin to take place. So the hope for the future is that worst case scenario, we've got 6 more years of this administration, and everybody else that's involved in this supports the deal. And through programs like what we're involved in, which is educating the next generation, hopefully those that are entering the field will share our view that the deal is working as it should work, and that we should look elsewhere if we're going to find ways to strengthen our security in the region.
Okay, thank you so much. So with that note, with that positive note, I would like to conclude today's lecture. But thank you so much, Joe. That was really, really informative, and we learned lots of things. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Thank you. I'm going to stop recording.